Already deep into his second-term trade wars, President Trump now doubling his punch on steel and aluminum tariffs.
We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States.
Decision to raise tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25 to 50%.
President Trump's increased tariffs on steel and aluminum took effect overnight. He is doubling the tariffs from 25% to 50%.
Donald Trump has told a rally at a U.S. steel plant in Pennsylvania that he intends to double U.S. steel import tariffs to 50%.
The news clips end, but the shock they leave behind is only the beginning. A 50% tariff was supposed to be a show of strength, a strategy to protect American workers, and a warning to trading partners that Washington was done being patient. But what followed, no one in the White House, the markets, or the factories bracing for impact truly expected. The ground shifted, the confidence cracked, and the power balance across North America changed in days, not years. One signature from President Trump sent the entire steel and aluminum supply chain into a spiral. Overnight, material prices spiked, orders froze, and trucks carrying Canadian steel were turned around before even reaching Michigan. It felt like a door that had always been open, suddenly slammed shut. And in that moment of uncertainty, something far bigger began unfolding behind the scenes. For decades, Canada supplied the United States with the steel that built its pipelines, its bridges, its cars, and its most iconic industries. From Detroit's auto plants to Texas oil fields, Canadian steel was the quiet backbone America depended on. But the new 50% tariff didn't just disrupt a business relationship, it ignited a transformation. Because while Washington was preparing for a confrontation, Ottawa was preparing for something else entirely, a revolution. Factories along the Great Lakes began to stumble almost immediately. Hot-rolled coil prices shot to $900 a ton, rising $150 in just 2 weeks. Automakers were sent scrambling. The Ford F-150, America's best-selling truck, depends on a full ton of steel. Multiply that by millions of vehicles, and the math turns painful fast. Ford warned Congress that the tariff alone would cost the company $2.5 billion by year's end. GM and Stellantis were no better off. Every hour meant more losses, more production delays, and more unanswered questions. Dealerships raised prices by $1,500 to $2,000 on some of the most popular models. Cars made in Mexico surged even higher, some by 25%. Families walked into showrooms and walked right back out. The affordability crisis went from bad to worse, and while all of this was happening, a separate shockwave hit American energy producers. Texas drillers suddenly found themselves short on piping materials. Enbridge was forced to dig through old inventory just to keep systems running. Small contractors couldn't compete at all. It wasn't just metal that dried up. It was momentum, jobs, and confidence. But while the U.S. side struggled, Canada made a move that changed everything. Ottawa did not react with anger. It reacted with strategy. Within 48 hours, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a $1 billion national overhaul of the steel industry. Not to compete with the United States, but to outrun it. Old coal-based furnaces were replaced with electric arc and hydrogen systems. What started as a tariff dispute became a clean tech race, and Canada was suddenly ahead. Hydroelectric and nuclear power gave Canada something the U.S. could not replicate quickly: cleaner steel. And in a world preparing for Europe's 2026 carbon border adjustment mechanism, clean steel is the new gold. Europe wanted it. Asia wanted it. Even Japan showed interest. And Canada was ready. Then came the move that stunned traders worldwide. On July 16th, Canada imposed strict quotas and flat 25% duties on foreign steel, especially Chinese steel. Ottawa made one thing clear: Canada would not become a dumping ground for the world's excess. It would become a premium supplier, selective, strategic, and prepared for the future. Canadian steel that once flowed south began flowing east, toward Europe. And with its high emission score of 93% compliance, European ports welcomed it without penalty. The U.S. was losing access to the same metal it had taken for granted for half a century. Detroit felt the collapse immediately. Plants slowed to a crawl. Workers described the atmosphere as terrifying, like living through the financial crisis all over again. Michigan's unemployment rate climbed to 5.4%, one of the highest in America. Small towns that depended on steel shipments from Canada experienced something they had never seen. Silence. No trucks, no train horns, no overtime shifts, just uncertainty. Meanwhile, across the border, Hamilton's mills roared back to life. For the first time in years, Canada was not fighting for survival. It was setting the pace. But the consequences weren't contained by borders. The human cost was brutal on both sides. Windsor, Canada's longtime auto hub, felt the shock deeply. Families with generations in the industry watched their shifts get cut, their benefits shrink, and their futures blur. Union halls filled with fear. Layoffs spread from Ontario to Saskatchewan. 500,000 Canadian jobs linked to U.S. exports now stood at risk because Washington's tariff wall was higher than ever. And then came the second blow. The White House announced an additional 35% tariff on Canadian exports, tied to fentanyl accusations. Ottawa rejected the claim instantly. Markets responded within hours. Steel prices surged again. Shipping routes closed. And the fragile balance between two tightly connected economies snapped. By August, Canada's exports to the U.S. had dropped by 10 percentage points. Not because they couldn't sell, but because they stopped trying. Carney quietly redirected trade to Asia and Europe. Canada bypassed U.S. customs altogether. Ships sailed around Florida, around the Atlantic, toward ports where tariffs weren't waiting to punish them. Washington expected Canada to negotiate. Instead, Canada rebuilt. European demand surged. Asian buyers signed long-term contracts. India showed interest. Japan opened talks. And unlike the United States, locked in a tariff war, Canada used its clean tech advantage to gain leverage in markets that weren't even part of the original dispute. The U.S. Congress attempted diplomacy. Senators begged Ottawa to ease the metal blockade. Carney refused, not out of revenge, but because the new strategy was already working. Canada wasn't simply a supplier anymore. It was becoming a gatekeeper, a country controlling the direction, the flow, and the standard of steel across the modern world. Even when U.S. steel prices temporarily softened in late July, it didn't matter. Canada had already pivoted. Ottawa's policies were no longer temporary bandages. They were long-term architecture. Premier Doug Ford aligned Ontario with federal rules, demanding Canadian-made steel for all major projects. Saskatchewan and Alberta followed. The Made in Canada era had begun. Detroit, meanwhile, was drowning in material shortages, higher prices, and political uncertainty. The White House insisted tariffs were meant to protect American jobs. But inside union halls across Michigan and Ohio, workers asked the same question. Protect who? Because the only thing they were seeing was layoffs, stalled factories, and lost orders. And while all of this played out in North America, a second global shock unfolded, almost quietly, but powerful enough to reshape geopolitics. Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived in India for a state visit that Western media barely covered. Yet the impact was massive. India and Russia agreed to expand trade through 2030, strengthen currency arrangements that bypass the US dollar, and lay the foundation for a free trade zone with the Eurasian Economic Union. 96% of transactions now bypass the dollar entirely. India signaled a serious diplomatic interest in shaping future peace negotiations in Europe. Russia, meanwhile, sought a balance that prevented overdependence on China. Two major powers, one nuclear, one rising, quietly aligned in ways that challenged the very system Washington has dominated for decades. As North America entered a steel war, Asia was constructing a new financial order. Both shocks were unfolding simultaneously, and America was caught in the middle. The tariff meant to protect U.S. industries ended up accelerating Canada's rise, Europe's clean tech requirements, and Asia's political realignment. What was supposed to be a defensive move turned into a global shift, one the United States will feel for years. No conflict is ever just about metal. It's about influence. It's about leverage. And above all, it's about who controls the next chapter of economic power. America made its move, Canada made its counter, and the world adjusted.